Hey, I'm Shaye Wanner, and you are listening to the Casual Cattle Conversations podcast. Whether you are a seasoned rancher or just curious about the cattle world, this podcast dives into the stories, science, and strategies shaping the future of ranching. Let's get started and keep your herd ahead of the herd. Folks, today Mark Johnson and I are visiting about creep feeding and what to consider from a profitability standpoint. It's a short and sweet conversation, but does not lack invaluable information. Now remember, if you are looking for a speaker who can relate to ranchers, truly resonate with your audience, and get real about the realities of the cattle world, I'm booking for 2025 and 2026. You can reach out to me on my website, casualcattleconversations.com. But with that, let's visit with Mark. Grazing without limits and ranching without boundaries. Unlock the full potential of every acre with SenseHub Fence, the smarter way to manage your cattle herd. Cut costs, conserve resources, control grazing across even the toughest terrain with virtual fencing that combines real-time herd data with powerful hands-off precision. Profit, sustainability, and efficiency, all in one system. SenseHub Vents puts smarter grazing at your fingertips, saving you time, effort, and money compared to traditional fencing. Ready to transform your ranch? Learn more at ventsfence.com, and that link is in the show notes. All right, Mark. Well, it is a pleasure to have you back on the podcast. I know a while ago you were on and got to talk about creep grazing. Today we're going to talk about creep feeding a little more. So thanks for joining me again and visiting with my audience. All right. Well, I think it's my favorite question. I don't know if it's my guest's favorite question, but why do you bet on the beef industry? And I always ask this question just because it's a little bit of a different approach to help us get to know you.
Well, I believe that the beef industry has a great story to tell. God made cattle with a rumen and a very complicated digestive system, which permits cows to go out and take forage and fiber and things that we as humans could not digest and do anything with. We would literally starve to death in the middle of knee-high grass prairie. But a cow can take that in many different forms and many different parts of the country and turn it into milk and beef, which you can argue that beef is nature's perfect food when you think about the caloric density relative to all the essential nutrients that come out of it. And this occurs in a sustainable, regenerative fashion, however anyone wants to define those words. You were talking about a beef industry that works where cows return digested manure that ends up being fertilizer to grow the next season of grass. And it is, I believe, especially when we think about the land stewardship, the husbandry that we provide in the beef industry, it is a really good story to tell.
It absolutely is. And a lot of people go back to how cows are such amazing upcyclers of resources that humans cannot use. So I appreciate your answer. And, you've been on the show before, but can you just briefly remind listeners, especially because there's some new listeners now, what is your role in the beef industry today? Tell us a little bit about what you do for your career.
Well, I have been a cattleman since the age of 7. So about 54 years ago, I earned my first cow when I got big enough to actually be able to pop the clutch on a 1-ton feed truck and drive it through the winter months for my dad. I earned a black baldy cow. I've owned cattle ever since then. Currently, my family and I would operate J&J Beef Genetics in Orlando, Oklahoma. That's purebred Angus cattle, a handful of purebred Charolais, and a lot of commercial cow-calf. We have about 480 acres of pasture, close to 100 cows. That's what my family would do. For the past 33 years, I've been a professor of animal science here at Oklahoma State University. And during that time have taught, done beef extension programming, and teach a lot in the beef cattle field, and did coach about 20 livestock judging teams here once upon a time as well.
That's a lot. So, Mark, as we transition into the topic at hand and what people are probably most excited to hear about today, we're going to talk about creep feeding. So, when you think about creep feeding as a management practice, what are the main advantages producers see from implementing this practice?
Well, I think the concept of creep feeding in its just most straightforward form is we are going to put some sort of a feed ration that growing calves pre-weaning have access to that their mothers don't. So, we call it creep feeding because typically we put up some sort of a creep gate that had openings big enough for a growing calf to get through, but not a mature cow. And the bottom line of it is to put additional weight on calves through additional nutritional resources that those calves have access to.
So the weight advantage is hands down probably the number one reason I talk about or I hear producers talking about using it. I've also heard some producers that like it as almost like a pre-weaning tool before calves get into the backgrounding phase because maybe they're used to eating out of a bunk a little bit or eating on their own. Is that something that, or a reason that you see producers turning to it as well?
I would agree that's a benefit as well. When we think about calves going through weaning and that potential stress of being separated from their mother, if we've got them on a good plane of nutrition and their digestive system has developed that ability to eat a higher energy, higher protein feed, then at the point of dam removal, you've got a calf that's in a good plane, positive plane of nutrition and accustomed to whether eating from a creep feeder out of a bunk. It reduces the level of stress on them, and that would be a plus.
What about some of the disadvantages or reasons that producers may choose not to make creep feed available?
That's a great question. And, historically, if we looked at data, research projects, we get into multiple layers of questions here. And then probably just the initial one to fire out there is that we didn't find it in a commercial cow-calf operation. We did not find it cost effective relative to the cost to gain and the value of a pound of a weaned calf to put the additional weight on them. And you get past that, creep feeding takes on all these layers of complications. You've got to have a feeder. You've got to keep the feed fresh. You've got to keep rodents out of the feed. You've got to have the creep gate. You've got to have all this structured so the calves get in and have access, but the cows don't. And so you get into some equipment and management issues there at an additional level that you wouldn't have if you weren't creep feeding. And then what is the form of that additional weight we put on? And in some cases, historically, we might have talked about getting calves a little overly conditioned as a result of maybe a long-term creep feeding. And so those calves, they had additional weight when they went to the marketplace, but they were taking a discount because they were a little overly fat. And so long-term, most of the data you would look at collected at land-grant universities would tell you that from a commercial cow-calf segment standpoint, creep feeding was seldom a profitable practice. Now, the current cattle market we're in is a game changer in that particular regard.
Tired of accounting software that wasn't built for ranching? Ambrook is the smart, simple tool that helps farmers and ranchers manage their finances like a pro. Is the pasture you're renting paying you back for the lease? Is your hay making or losing money, factoring in what you save for using it as feed? Is that old piece of equipment worth the maintenance costs? Ambrook can help you answer these questions and works on any computer or smartphone, so you can manage it on the go. Visit ambrook.com/casual cattle to try it for free for 1 month. That's ambrook.com/casual cattle. So what you said just there indicates that the cattle market is a factor as to if it's profitable or not. What other factors can tie into whether producers are going to see a return on investment from creep feeding?
That is the one that I think in this market producers have to put a pencil to and determine the equipment, the management, the actual cost of gain, right down to the type of ration or nutritional supplement that we're going to provide for those calves pre-weaning. If that can be done, and when weaned calves are worth $3 a pound or more, which we have seen now for an extended period of time, when your cost of gain is less than that, this potentially becomes a profitable practice. Obviously, I'm in Oklahoma. We've lived through droughts 2 of the past 3 summers, and we've been in this really good cattle market, last summer. Creep feeding at my house penciled out to make sense. We were putting gain on for far less than what a pound of that gain was worth. We had drought-stressed pastures, a lack of a lot of standing forage. And so the year 2024 in Oklahoma, in our operation, creep feeding penciled out. I talk about the type of ration you're feeding and how important that is, and it's got to be cost effective. Based on forage availability, programs like Oklahoma Gold, a long-standing program developed here in Oklahoma a long time ago, is a form of creep feeding whereby we provide a little protein supplementation. And like late summer, if we've got ample standing forage, that is pretty cost effective. If we get into certain types of feeds, maybe it's not a real well-balanced ration, maybe it's not overly palatable, we get into issues with spoilage, one thing or another. There's a lot of data out there that shows us that just the amount of feed to the pound of gain can be all over the board when it comes to creep feeding. And that's where we've got to have the right ration that can be put out there cost effectively, whether it's fed or supplemented. And again, in a market like we're in, it definitely is more of a green light to investigate those type of things when you know what the value of a pound of weaned calf is going to be.
Do you want to talk a little bit more about what producers need to consider as far as the ration that they're going to put into those feeders? Because I know a lot of people might just rely on what the local feed store has available. I've had other producers tell me maybe they're pulling out of the bin depending on what they grow on the farming side. So dive into that a little bit more and share with us what considerations we need to think about to make sure that it is going to be a good ration, that it will pay off.
Yeah, I'll talk first just about Oklahoma Gold. The way it was established as a late summer basic protein supplementation to growing calves is because our crude protein content is good enough in the months of May and June in warm season grasses that it typically facilitates growth and meets the protein and energy requirements of a growing calf pretty well. As that warm season grass gets more mature, we start thinking about July, August, September, you see protein drop low enough even though we may have ample standing forage. That's when a little bit of high protein supplementation, you get that benefit. The calves can go digest all that standing forage with the protein supplementation, and that's a pretty effective program. If we're just looking at feeding, if we're talking about filling up a feeder, giving calves access to it with a creep gate, depending on what the size of the calves are and what stage in life we're going to start them, we typically need to be at a crude protein content 14 to 16%. And I would think higher to 16% if we're talking about really young growing calves. If we're talking about 4, 5, 6 month old calves that we're putting out creep feed, maybe just in the last month or two prior to weaning, then a 14% crude protein ration, probably closer to where we need to be. Energy content there becomes important as well. TDN, we're typically thinking more along the lines of something well above 60 as we get into that energy content.
So, you talked about you were talking about some historical data at the beginning, a lot of research done by land-grant universities. In that research, how long were people creep feeding or making that supplement available to those calves before sale day? What's the time period there?
I guess I would just put that in a nutshell. I think a lot of the take-home message from that is that you can creep feed in the month to 2 months prior to weaning, and get about as much bang for your buck as trying to have a creep feeder full for several months as those calves are growing.
Is there anything else that you think producers really miss or don't think through when it comes to this creep feeding conversation?
We did an interview last summer, I think, where we talked about creep grazing. And if there is the possibility in a cattle operation to have a trap or a grazing paddock that, again, only calves have access to, and maybe whether it's no-till, maybe it's something in Oklahoma, maybe it is a well-fertilized Bermuda grass grazing paddock, but to give calves access to something like Bermuda grass, crabgrass, a really good quality, higher protein, improved type of forage that only they can get to and eat in the late summer months, you can get a pretty effective cost of gain and a good return on your investment there in lieu of putting out an actual feed in the form of creep feed.
And what's interesting about that conversation is I had a friend who's very familiar and works in the virtual fencing space quite a bit, and because calves don't have the virtual fence collars on them, that technology almost sets those ranchers up for a creep grazing scenario, because even in a regular pasture, the calves can move ahead where their mothers can't.
I would agree. That's a potential benefit there. And again, then when it comes to creep grazing, it probably overall it doesn't get as complicated as creep feeding. If the calves got a nook or cranny they can get through to some forage that the cows can't, it's just a means of additional nutrition for them.
All right. Well, anything else, Mark? I mean, we're kind of keeping this short and sweet today, but if there's more you want to talk about, by all means.
You began this, why am I bullish on the beef industry? And one of the things that I love about this business is that we produce cattle in so many different production environments and different levels of management inputs that it is not a one size fits all business. And I really encourage people to put a pencil and paper and calculator to it to figure out where you get return on investment. And the creep feeding thing is a very interesting topic in 2025. And again, a lot of it is that point in the cattle cycle that we're at and what we see the value of calves at. And it might have been something that for 20, 30, 40 years just doesn't pencil out, but it might pencil out right now.
Absolutely. Well, for those of you out there listening, be sure to check the show notes for any resources that were mentioned today. And I will also include a link in there to the full podcast episode that Mark and I did about creep grazing, because he does go into a lot more detail on that management practice specifically in that full podcast interview. So all of that will be linked down in the description. Remember, the best way to support this podcast and your other favorite podcast is to leave a rating or review, and, of course, share it with a friend who might find the content interesting. But with that, happy ranching, folks.